I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's program, the Bernard G. Siegel Memorial Lecture in Law and Ethics. And a special welcome to anyone who's studying with JTS for the first time today. This is one of many online learning offerings we have available, so we hope you'll peruse those on the JTS website. But the Siegel Lecture does really hold a special place in our hearts, in my heart anyway. Convening this annual forum to discuss questions of law and ethics through a Jewish lens and bringing together the Jewish legal and ethical tradition with pressing issues in the world today. We had to cancel the Siegel Lecture last year. It was meant to happen just shortly after the pandemic hit us here, so we're really happy to be having the lecture this year, and especially on such an important topic, reparations for Black Americans. What can Holocaust reparations teach us? We're so grateful to our panel of expert scholars, Professor Margalynne J. Armstrong, Professor William A. Darity Jr., and Dr. Susan Nyman, and I'll introduce them at more length in a moment. Just about the Siegel Lecture. So this annual lecture was established by JTS in honor of the late Bernard G. Siegel, who was a philanthropist and community leader. He was the first Jewish president of the American Bar Association and first Jewish chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association. In addition to his longtime career with the law firm of Schneider, Harrison, Siegel, and Lewis, he carried out special assignments for Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and he worked tirelessly to extend the influence of the organized bar in matters of legal policy nationwide. He was recognized for his, quote, indefatigable efforts to expand and improve legal services for the poor, the powerless, and the dispossessed. Siegel was involved as a lay leader and supporter with his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, the Jewish Publication Society, the Philadelphia Allied Jewish Appeal, and the Hebrew University, where the law library is named for him. And JTS awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws degree in 1977. We're really pleased to have with us two people directly connected to Bernie Siegel, Mr. Mark Cohen, who is his grandson, and Mr. Bruce Rosenfield, his former law partner. So we're so happy that you're both here, albeit online. I'll look forward to seeing you again in person at the next Siegel Lecture, and we thank you, Bruce Rosenfield, for everything that you've done to help bring this program to fruition. The topic of reparations is one that is only slowly coming into the mainstream, as it should be in the American conversation, and it's come into the mainstream Jewish conversation even more slowly. I might even say it's not even here at all yet. To my knowledge, this is the first event convened by a major Jewish organization exploring this topic, and we're privileged and honored to be doing that at JTS, but also feel that we're really stepping up to a challenge that is kind of overdue, and that the Jewish community as a whole we want everyone to step up into. We heard the really inspiring words of Amanda Gorman back in January in her inauguration poem, "The Hill We Climb." She said, I can't read it with her amazing cadence, but she said, "It's because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." So we hope that the conversation today is a Jewish communal contribution to that long overdue process of repair, which is a very complex one, which is why we've brought together three leading scholars to discuss it. And repairing anything begins with understanding it. So that's what we're here today to do. And I'll just close my opening with a verse from the Torah, from Leviticus 19. This section of the Bible is called by scholars the Holiness Code. It begins by God saying, to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. And then a series of instructions and laws follow. And each of the laws in there, I think, is elevated because of that introduction, because of God saying, this is what it means to emulate divine holiness. One of the laws in there, in the Holiness Code, is lo talin pe'ulat zechir itcha ad boker, that you should not keep the wages of a day laborer with you overnight. And I think we can say that we have kept the wages of the day laborer with us far beyond overnight. We've kept it with us for years and decades and centuries, and wages not only from the time of slavery, but from the time of Jim Crow, from the time of redlining, and from so many other times in American history. So let's begin the process of no longer withholding what is deserved. So on that note, I'm so honored to introduce our distinguished panelists. Margalynne J. Armstrong is Associate Professor of Law at Santa Clara University School of Law. She teaches race and law, critical race theory, constitutional law, property, and other courses. Her scholarship examines housing discrimination, race and law, and teaching about race and privilege. Prior to teaching, she worked as a legal services attorney for low-income clients, and she has received the Public Interest Award from the California Association of Black Lawyers. Her recent writing includes the article, Are We Nearing the End of Impunity for Taking Black Lives? And she also co-authored new materials for the 2021 reissue of Privilege Revealed. William A. Darity Jr. is the Samuel, I hope I'm saying this right, DuBois, Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. His research focuses on inequality by race, class and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling and the racial achievement gap, the economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution, and the history of economics. He's published or edited 13 books and over 300 articles, and he most recently co-authored From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And finally, Susan Nyman, whose book really, whose recent book was part of the inspiration for this program. She is director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, Germany, which brings together thought leaders from around the world to test new ideas in the arts and humanities, natural and social sciences, and ethics and politics. She was previously a professor of philosophy at Yale University and Tel Aviv University. Her areas of specialization are moral and political philosophy and the history of modern philosophy. Her most recent book that I refer to is Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Her other works include Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin, Evil in Modern Thought, and Moral Clarity, a Guide for Grown-Up Idealists. So our program today will go as follows. Each of our distinguished panelists will speak for about 15 minutes, beginning with Professor Darity, followed by Professor Armstrong, and then Dr. Nyman. After that, we'll have the privilege of conducting some conversation with them, and then we'll take questions from you. Just some instructions on that. So I will cue you when it's time to submit questions. Don't submit them yet because I'll be overwhelmed by them while I'm trying to listen to our panelists, but keep them. And the way you'll submit questions is using the chat feature. You send them directly to me, and I will select as many as I can to share with our panelists. So the chat is only open to JTS staff. If you have a technical or logistical question during the program, you can private chat with my colleague, Stacy Firestone. So to begin this conversation on reparations for Black Americans and what the Jewish community's own personal history with reparations for the Holocaust can teach us on that matter, I call on Professor Darity.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Handelman. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Tom Cagadan for all of the work that he has done to try to make this event happen, and to Stacy Firestone as well. I would like to begin actually by talking about a general definition of reparations that Kirsten Mullen and I use in our book, From Here to Equality. We define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. And in this context, we treat the notion of acknowledgement as being an admission or a recognition of responsibility on the part of a culpable party that has executed and or benefited from a major atrocity or a series of atrocities. And the culpable party admits that they have done wrong, but then proceeds to say that they are making a commitment to engage in an act of redress. And so the second feature of a reparations project must be the act of redress itself, which is restitution for the damages that have been caused. Frequently, that form of restitution has involved monetary payments. The obvious example of the German payments of reparations to the victims of the Holocaust is an example that I think we will be discussing in some greater detail today. But there are a number of other examples, and some are specific to the United States government, which includes the payments that the United States government made to Japanese American who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II. Also, there are instances in which the United States government has made payments to communities that have suffered harm, where the United States government itself was not necessarily the culpable party. A couple of illustrations are the payments that were made to families that lost loved ones in the course of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But also another example is the payments that the United States government made to individuals who were held hostage in Iran during the Carter administration. Those individuals were held hostage for 440 days, and they have received compensation in the form of $10,000 payments per day of hostage status. So each individual is receiving $4.4 million from the United States government, although the United States government was not the entity that took them hostage. So that's the second aspect, is redress, and I just wanted to emphasize that it's quite normal for the act of redress to take the form of monetary restitution. And then the third component that I'd like to emphasize is the notion of closure, which is the arrival at an agreement between the victimized community and the culpable party that the debt has been paid, that the account is settled. And this will mean that the victimized community does not bring forth any further claims on the culpable party unless there's a new set of atrocities that take place, or unless there is a renewal of the atrocities that precipitated the claim for redress. So those are the three components of reparations as we see it. That's a general definition. It will have certain kinds of specific features that will be determined by the particularities of each case in which atrocities are relevant to the designation of a program of reparations. But I'd like to focus next then on the case for reparations for Black Americans who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. So the first central point I'd like to make is that this is not a case that is built exclusively on the horrors of slavery. In fact, one could argue that the events that took place after slavery ended make just as compelling a case for reparations as slavery itself. So what are these events that are relevant to the case for Black American reparations? Well, the first is slavery, which is the crucible in which American white supremacy was formed and crystallized. But the second phase that's relevant to the case for reparations is nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States. A period that was accompanied by wave upon wave of white massacres that were conducted in towns and cities stretching across the nation, east to west, north to south. In the most extreme year, the year 1919, which was referred to as the Red Summer, and it actually was a more extended period than just the summer of 1919. But in that most extreme year, there were upwards of 35 of these massacres that took place in such far-flung locations as Bisbee, Arizona, Omaha, Nebraska, Chicago, Illinois, Elaine, Arkansas, Washington, D.C., Longview, Texas, and on and on. Perhaps the massacres that are most familiar to those of us who are in this conversation today, perhaps the most familiar massacre is the one that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. But I'm a resident of the state of North Carolina, which was the site of another horrendous massacre that took place earlier in 1898, in which a municipal coup d'etat was engineered by the white terrorists, and in the process, something that occurred in virtually all of these massacres also took place, and this goes beyond the massive loss of Black lives to the appropriation of Black-owned property by whites. So in many instances in which these massacres take place, they take place in context in which Black Americans had begun to display some visible evidence of prosperity, and that prosperity was effectively snatched away, violently snatched away. So that's the second phase that's relevant to the case for reparations. The third phase is the period that we are in now, in the aftermath of the passage of the civil rights legislation, a period in which we have ongoing atrocities, including mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, ongoing discrimination in housing, employment, and credit markets. But most significant from the standpoint of giving us an indicator or an index or a metric for determining how best to execute a reparations plan, most important from the standpoint of our project and From Here to Equality is the sustained and ongoing huge gap in wealth between Black and white Americans. And this is a disparity in wealth that reaches a magnitude of approximately $840,000 per household on average, a gap in net worth between Black and white households of approximately $840,000. That differential corresponds to a condition in which Black Americans who have ancestors who were enslaved in the United States constitute about 12% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. And to the extent that the Black-white wealth gap provides us with an indicator, the most effective indicator of the economic consequences of white supremacy cumulatively across generations, then that sets the standard for what must be the minimum task that has to be fulfilled by a reparations plan, and that's elimination of that racial wealth disparity. As a consequence, in From Here to Equality, in the final chapter, we actually sketch a plan for reparations that is anchored on elimination of the racial wealth disparity in the United States. And it's anchored on elimination of that racial wealth disparity precisely because the federal government is the party that engineered and executed and sanctioned a host of policies that took place that actually created this racial wealth difference. Let me highlight the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, in which the newly emancipated were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for the years of bondage. And that promise was not met. It was an unfulfilled promise. In contrast, 1.5 million white families, including recent immigrant white families, received 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories under the terms of the Homestead Act as the nation completed its colonial settler project. And these 160-acre land grants were essentially a major foundation for the wealth position of those families that carries over to the present day. In fact, the researcher Trina Williams-Shanks estimates that there are now 45 million living white Americans whose families have been beneficiaries of the Homestead Act patents. In addition, the waves of massacres that I described that involved the appropriation of Black-owned property reinforced the racial wealth gap in the United States. And it did so because the federal government either turned a blind eye or was complicitous in some of these uprisings. And it was complicitous, the federal government was complicitous insofar as it was the responsible source for some of the arms that were used in these white terrorist campaigns. And then we turn to the 20th century, where federal policy for asset building shifts away from land allocation and begins to focus on home ownership. And once it begins to focus on home ownership, we have a set of policies that go into place that are discriminatorily applied. So they promote wealth building for white Americans to the detriment of the wealth position of Black Americans. Two pieces of legislation are relevant. One is the legislation that brought into being the Federal Housing Administration. Another is the GI Bill. And it's in the context of the Federal Housing Administration's practices that we had the introduction of a formal apparatus at the national level of redlining, which resulted in credit deprivation in Black communities for potential homeowners, and also precipitated huge differences in the equity value of Black and white owned homes in the United States. So again, it's federal policy that's influencing or affecting the wealth gap in the United States. So we argue ultimately, and I'll conclude with this, that a plan for reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery must, first of all, specify that that is the community that is eligible to receive reparations. Second, that the reparations project must be designed in such a way that it eliminates racial wealth differences in the United States. We estimate that this would require an expenditure of at least $11 trillion to close the gap. Third, that the gap must be closed by making direct payments to eligible recipients. These may or may not be cash transfers. There are other ways in which one can make direct payments. For example, eligible recipients could be provided with trust accounts. They could be provided with some form of an endowment, something less liquid than a direct cash transfer. But ultimately, they must have full discretion over the use of the funds. And then finally, the federal government as culpable party and as capable party, because it's only the federal government that truly can meet a bill of this amount, the federal government should be responsible for making payment. And so these are the four characteristics that I think are central to an effective reparations plan for Black American descendants of US slavery. And I'd like to use those four pillars as the starting point for the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Darity, for laying that foundation for us. Professor Armstrong, I'll turn to you.
I have to unmute, this being Zoom, of course. First of all, I'd really like to give my thanks to JTS for sponsoring and establishing this program and inviting me. I think it's very important for people to understand that reparations is an issue that really affects everyone in the United States. To quote Faulkner, the past is never dead. It's not even past, because we are living in a country in which the distribution of wealth, as Professor Darity has so splendidly profiled the history, is very much dependent on a racial caste system that really excluded African Americans from participating in the events and opportunities that gave rise to the wealth of the United States. As I am a professor of law, I'll talk a bit about the legal approaches, but I did want to add a couple of elements to what Professor Darity spoke about. And the first thing I really like to emphasize is that when people talk about slavery reparations, it really diminishes the discussion because of so much continuing exclusion from all sorts of opportunities in the United States, political, economic, social. When one thinks of the vast amount of human potential that was simply wasted and buried because of racial prejudice, America has lost a lot, but no group more than African Americans. And so to look just at the 20th century and the kinds of events that Professor Darity spoke about, there was vast amounts of unpunished murder, labor theft, and exclusion from opportunity through the federal policy deals with the Dixiecrats that were the precursors of the Nixon's Southern strategy that kept African Americans from the benefits of the New Deal in ways that are still reflected. For example, Social Security excluded domestic workers and labor, agricultural laborers, specifically to appease the Southern Dixiecrats who were adamant against African Americans getting any type of economic benefit from these government programs. There was also the inability to own property or really do anything but pass through or work in a number of American cities and towns. To read the book Sundown Towns explains how extensive it was to exclude African Americans from being able to reside in communities across the country. And even the things that you might look at as being progress in terms of civil rights, such as Brown versus Board of Education, have not been that successful in terms of increasing the access of African Americans to quality education. The amount of segregation that exists now is greater than the segregation that existed at the time that Brown versus Board of Education was decided. And there was extensive evasion of Brown in the towns that were, and school districts that were specifically covered by the decision. And after the Earl Warren Court was replaced by the Burger Court and the Rehnquist Court, those courts dismantled the structural remedies for segregation that were created under the Warren Court. And furthermore, there was significant Black displacement through urban renewal programs that again deprived Black Americans of the little wealth that they had been able to accumulate by simply using eminent domain, the power of the government, to displace African Americans. And of course, there's also the mass incarceration that's been mentioned. But mass incarceration really has to be understood as choices that were made by governments to criminalize and emphasize criminality in terms of pretty much discretionary laws, such as the laws regarding the possession of drugs, marijuana in particularly, which is now, of course, being something that is permitted by law. And yet and still the African American community isn't quite able to participate in the wealth generation that legalization is causing, in part because there's so little accumulated wealth that can be used to capitalize the legalization profits. So in terms of legal approaches to the reparations issue, we think of law as being often judicially focused. And judicial remedies are very limited with respect to compensation for past harms that were done to groups. So unless you can establish an individual injury under the theory of standing that is expressed by the Supreme Court as a prerequisite for being able to pursue a case in federal court, unless you can establish standing, the door is completely closed. And given the lack of records that are available with respect to so many people who were enslaved, and due to the lack of an ability to really establish all of the kind of losses that were incurred because of exclusion by the law, it would be very difficult to use the court system to redress the losses that African Americans have suffered. Even if you pursue equitable theories such as unjust enrichment, the theories really aren't sufficient. One, because of the kind of gravity of the injuries that slavery and the deprivation of civil rights have imposed upon the African American community. And the idea of unjust enrichment, again, requires the ability to show pretty much exactly how people have been enriched. And in terms of monetizing that or figuring out what numbers there are, we can certainly approximate how much the Black community has lost, but it's really not within the abilities of courts to be able to resolve these issues. And so a number of reparations lawsuits that were brought around the turn of this century, the 21st century, they didn't really get very far because of those procedural barriers. So when we're talking about reparations, we really have to look to legislative sources. And we're beginning to see some legislative responses with respect to reparations. I think one of the most formed ones or more complete ones is what's happening in Evanston, Illinois, in terms of making reparations available to eligible Black residents for the harms that were imposed by discriminatory housing policies, and also inaction on the part of Evanston in terms of protecting people who were persecuted by neighbors for going into the wrong neighborhoods or renting or buying or trying to buy a property there. So the city has recognized both their policies and their inactions that prevented African Americans from being able to acquire housing through ownership, and the ensuing disparities in wealth that we're talking about. If you actually go to Evanston, Illinois, you can really see the differences between the communities where African Americans were isolated and the surrounding communities, which are much wealthier, much better supported in terms of the infrastructure that was provided. And it's really an illustration of what happened throughout the United States, where Black residents were forced to live in communities that were limited and excluded from being able to pursue housing opportunities elsewhere. And the exclusion was through zoning. The exclusion was through the kind of policies that Professor Darity talked about with respect to being excluded from GI loans and from FHA guaranteed loans. And so many times African Americans who were in a position to acquire a home would have to use a kind of contract lending system that was very, very onerous, because if you missed one payment, there was no right of redemption. That was it. You lost all of the equity that you had in the home in terms of how you'd been paying down the principal, and you would have to start all over again in terms of trying to acquire ownership of that property. So you have this disparity in the ability to acquire funding from sources that were either guaranteed by the government or that were regulated in ways that prevented these kinds of losses. So Evanston's approach is a really fine approach in terms of being pinpointed to people who can be identified. And I think that is something that's more palatable generally to the public because there is a specific injury that can be cited. Even though the injuries that have been suffered by the Black community are still, as I've said, palpable, and we're still living through them. There's also been discussion of reparations in the federal government. There's a House bill, HR 40, that wants to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. This is a proposal that gets dubbed as a slavery reparations program when it is trying to look beyond slavery. But this terminology of being slavery reparations is again designed to kind of divert attention from the ongoing loss of opportunities. California also has a gubernatorial task force to study the impacts of, slavery specifically in California. And California's responsibility for African American inequality goes so far beyond slavery. California was not a slave state, but slavery was permitted because the law wasn't really enforced against slavery. And so until the end of the Civil War, California had slavery, but after the Civil War, the efforts to keep African Americans from settling in the state, and again, the limitations on where they lived, continued well into the 21st century, and we still have the effects now in terms of the housing patterns. A really great book that describes all of this is Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, that looks specifically at California and the Bay Area, which is seen as this bastion of liberalism, and shows how much the law restricted the ability of African Americans to live on an equal basis to other citizens. So I'll end with this and participate in the questions and answers. Again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Armstrong. Dr. Nyman.
So, just like Professor Darity and Professor Armstrong, I want to thank JTS for organizing this event, but I'd like to add something to what Rabbi Andelman said before, as to this being the first discussion of reparations in the Jewish community. It may be the first discussion that specifically completely focused on reparations. But I have been enormously pleased and proud about how many Jewish organizations have stepped up to the plate since the murder of George Floyd. And I have to say, my own book talks, there's a chapter on reparations, but its subject more generally is what Germans call working off the past, or what we might call reckoning with the past, which includes reparations, but includes a whole breadth of things. And I have been invited by Holocaust museums, I mean, the one in Washington, but all over the country. I have been, to do all kinds of things, often partnering with African-American civil rights groups, but instigated by the Jewish community. And it's made me happily feel that at least a large part of the Jewish community still feels allegiance to the Universalist tradition in Judaism, which is the tradition that I grew up in. So things are better than I might have assumed. I've been asked to speak about the German case, but I want to first add a couple of things about the American case. And both Professor Armstrong and Professor Darity emphasized that we really shouldn't be talking about reparations for slavery. We should be talking about the 100 years, or well, it's more than 100 years now, after slavery. I have a proposal that I think might help. This may be a completely quixotic crusade of mine, but I want to get rid of the words Jim Crow, because I think every time we pronounce the words Jim Crow, we paper over what Brian Stevenson calls the age of racial terror. And, it perpetuates our ignorance, and it perpetuates our acknowledgement of what actually went on. You hear the words Jim Crow and you think, okay, there were these prejudiced people doing racial caricatures in blackface, and that's too bad. But you do not think of lynching. You do not think of convict leasing. Professor Armstrong mentioned, of course, the way in which, as I hope most of us know, you can take all the cocaine you want to if you work on Wall Street and usually get away with it. But crack use or sales are punished very, very differently. But let's forget about drug problems. What shocked me, and it's a book, if people haven't read it, that I strongly recommend, Slavery by Another Name, by Douglas, why am I blocking on his name? Anyway, just look up Slavery by Another Name. It discusses the convict leasing system, which really in many ways was more brutal and more lethal than chattel slavery. The other thing that it did for us white people was to criminalize ordinary actions when undertaken by Black people. I mean, the expressions like driving while Black come essentially, they're ironic spin-offs on the Black codes, which in the South at least turned all kinds of ordinary actions, whistling near a white woman, selling vegetables after sundown, turned them into crimes for which people could be jailed indefinitely. And then not only ripped up lives of those people. They created an image of Black men in particular as inherently criminal and inherently dangerous. So I think all of those things need to be considered. And one way to begin is to get rid of that stupid euphemism, Jim Crow. Let me talk a little bit about the German case. It's very important not to idealize the Germans. I have written, and it's true, that the Germans were the first nation historically to move from seeing themselves as victims to acknowledging that they were perpetrators. It will sound shocking to you. I've seen people's mouths drop open when I say this, but in the early decades after the Second World War, the majority of West Germans saw themselves as the worst victims of the war. I know that sounds crazy, but to those of us who have been raised outside of Germany, but their arguments are ones that I think you'll probably recognize. They lost the war. They lost a portion of their territory. Their cities were in ashes and ruins. They had lost 7 million people. Their men were wounded or in prisoner of war camps if they were still alive. And on top of it, those occupying forces insisted on blaming them for starting the war. I hope that rings some bells with people, because in fact, as I discovered while doing this research, they used the same tropes as do defenders of the lost cause. Okay, and that should give us a certain amount of hope, I think, because if even with a great deal of difficulty, former Nazis were able to move from this self-pitying, self-victimizing move to say, yeah, okay, we did suffer during the war and we suffered after the war, but other people suffered more and their suffering was our fault, then it seems to me that we in America can do the same thing. But they didn't do it immediately by any means whatsoever. And the first and largest batch of reparations were paid in the early 50s, and they were very unwilling. Once again, that ought to give us hope. The last time I checked, the number of Americans who were in favor of reparations to Black Americans was actually higher than the number of Germans who were in favor of reparations when they were initially offered. It was very, very low. Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of West Germany, basically wanted to be accepted into the political world, the family of Western nations. There's some evidence that he actually himself did think something was offered to Jewish victims of the Nazis, but his initial offer was 2 million. I mean, it was just a ridiculously low sum. There were secret negotiations, because both sides were actually opposed. The majority of Germans were opposed to giving reparations, and a large number of Israelis were opposed to taking them. People felt they were trying to be bought off with blood money and that no money could make up for the deaths of their families. There was, even as the Israeli parliament was debating reparations, there was a violent demonstration led by Menachem Begin, later Prime Minister of Israel, in which windows of the Knesset were broken. So these were very controversial things to have been done. Nevertheless, they finally agreed on a sum and a legal argument. There was, of course, a problem in paying reparations to an entity that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed, namely the State of Israel. There were payments made to individual Holocaust survivors. I have to tell you, they were painfully small. and the amount of documentation that had to be given was heartbreakingly cruel. Provide 2 witnesses that you were actually there and that it's led to problems in your health and, it was another reason why many proud survivors said, forget it, I'm not going through this. But the state of Israel desperately needed, we are talking the year 1952, desperately needed funds and made the quite legitimate argument that they had taken in a large number of refugees who themselves were so damaged by the time that they had spent in concentration camps that most of them, many of them couldn't work at all, and few of them could contribute to building up the new state. And that argument was accepted, the reparations were paid. However, even so, there was a catch, and the catch is pretty bad. The catch was never stated formally, but the idea of Adenauer's government, and he actually had to go to the opposition Social Democrats because his own party wouldn't give him enough votes to agree to any reparations. The Social Democrats did. The catch was, okay, we'll pay, and you will let us shut up. That is, you will not complain about the millions of former Nazis who are still holding public office. You will not demand that we do any kind of reckoning in our education policies. If we've paid our debt, and you've got the money and that's it. Of course, this was all put in rather diplomatic language, and it's, as far as I've been able to tell, it's never been written down, but it was an understood policy for West Germany. East Germany had a very different situation. They paid huge amounts of money in reparations to Poland and Russia, both of which had been devastated by the invasion. And as far as I've been able to tell, there was not a lot of resentment among the East German population. They were quite aware that they had started the war and quite aware that the Wehrmacht had devastated those countries. And so there was a much more thorough program of reckoning in East Germany. But that's a separate subject, and we don't have time to go into it today. I want to mention the second group of reparations that were finalized in the year 2000. And what was important in the year 2000 is that in 1998, for the first time since Willy Brandt, there was a social democratic government, a coalition with the Green Party. And the Social Democrats, after the communists, were the first victims of the Nazis. So they were genuine anti-fascists, and they were quite concerned to break the silence and to make sure that all the people who had not received reparations so far got reparations. And most of those people had been slave laborers, not necessarily Jewish, fewer of them Jewish than not, but there were millions of slave laborers living in Eastern Europe who had not been compensated. And there are two things that were interesting in this, and I hope might be relevant to the American case. Two things that were interested in this second batch of reparations. One is they were provided by a foundation called Memory, Responsibility, and Future. And they very specifically insisted that part of the funds in the foundation go towards education about Nazi crimes. That is, they went absolutely against the understanding that had been the case in the first 45 years of Germany. If we pay, we don't have to do anything else. They insisted on being part of a general reckoning. The other thing, and I know that Professor Darity has already worked out a program, and he's the economist here, I'm not, but it may be relevant to further thinking about reparations. The second group of reparations in Germany was a joint effort between the federal government and I think something like 491 German businesses, large German businesses. And I just looked up before this program exactly the legal statement that those businesses made. They said, we want to say we are not legally guilty of anything, but we have a moral and historical responsibility because we know that many of these businesses profited from slave labor under the Nazis. And so we are voluntarily, giving several billion. I don't know what the amount is. It began with 5 billion government, 5 billion industry, and it's gone on. I don't know what the current figure. Professor Darity said the federal government can't meet the bill itself. Is the only organization that could meet the bill. I wonder about that. And I wonder if it isn't time to do some more research on what industry and what business profited off the exploitation of Black Americans. Professor Armstrong mentioned Richard Rothstein's wonderful book, and he has researched in detail the ways in which banks, for example, sometimes with complicity and under orders of federal mortgage programs and the federal government, but sometimes simply on their own. Banks profited by, insisting on segregated housing. And I'd like to say that I truly believe that segregated housing, of course, hurts Black citizens more than it hurts the rest of us, because it tends to mean poor neighborhoods, poor schools, poor resources, etc. But I truly believe that segregated housing hurts all of us in creating barriers to communities that are very, very hard to overcome if you live in one space and another group lives completely across town where you don't have normal opportunities to get to know each other. So I would strongly urge that at least in this one aspect, Americans take a leaf from the last and the best, really, form of German reparations and begin exploring and examining what industries were complicit, what industries owe their profits today to the exploitation of Black Americans, and calling them to the table. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyman, and thank you for correcting or responding to my comment about the good conversation that is happening in the Jewish community. So we have half an hour left. So I think what I'd like to do is, I'm sure all three of you have a lot of, this is your bread and butter, so you have so much more to say and you have responses to each other. But let me ask one question of each of you, and then we'll invite questions from the audience, and folks joining us, you can feel free at this point to start sending me questions via the chat, and I'll choose what I can. Let me start with Professor Darity. I'll just go in the same order that we started in. So there's an argument that if the federal government is the one footing the bill for a massive program of reparations, that you have people you have people paying into that who were very much not responsible for the injustices. You have later immigrants, because who's footing the bill is really the American taxpayer. So you have later immigrants, you have other persecuted populations, you have Black Americans themselves paying for those reparations. I wonder how you would respond to that argument, and I imagine you probably want to respond to what Dr. Nyman said too in her challenge about restricting this to the federal government.
So there are two different issues that you mentioned here. One issue is the question of who bears responsibility. The second question is who is paying, and they're not necessarily the same issues. Okay, so I would argue that the case that we make in From Here to Equality is one that wants to move us away from thinking about individuals having personal guilt in the first place. But anyone who lives in the United States, who has come to the United States at any point, is coming to a society in which they must necessarily take into account its history. I would presume that people don't migrate to the United States unless they think that there's something very attractive about the way in which the society is currently organized. And we can't explain how that society is currently organized without paying deep attention to the long trajectory of the exploitation of Black labor in the United States, an exploitation that goes beyond the years of slavery into the present moment. And so I would say that, if you migrate to a country, you migrate to its history and you migrate to its responsibilities. But that's different from saying that the individuals who comprise the United States as a polity necessarily have to pay out of their own pockets for a reparations program. And I think that this is a critical issue that has to do with a very different conception of fiscal policy in the United States from the one that we all seem to be too deeply wedded to, which is the idea that you have to raise taxes or raise revenue to finance a new national project. Instead of pay as you go, go and then pay, pay and then go is an alternative way of thinking about it. When we undertook these huge expenditures to try to address the problems of the pandemic, there was no increase in taxes. And it would have been ridiculous to raise taxes in the midst of a recession. So the government just went ahead and made the expenditure. And there is no barrier to the federal government, unlike other levels of government, expanding its level of expenditure indefinitely, except for the danger of inflation. And of course, I guess in the German experience, we know that inflation is something that we do not want to see accelerate and get out of control. But that means that you design the program in such a way that you minimize the risk of inflation. And in relatively depressed economic times, the risk of additional government expenditure generating significant inflation is extremely low. We propose in the pages of From Here to Equality that the allocation of revenues or resources that have to be distributed as reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery be distributed over a period of a decade, no longer than a decade, but in such a fashion that the annual expenditure probably would be no more than $1.5 trillion. And that has very different implications from paying out $11 trillion at one time. And then we also say that, as I propose, that the direct payments don't necessarily have to take the form of cash transfers, that they could be in the form of less liquid assets. And so you wouldn't have this rush of expenditure in the immediate moment in which people receive the funds. So you wouldn't have the inflationary effects that come about there. I'm talking at length here, but I think that these are questions that require a substantive answer. And so the last issue I'd like to address is the question of the capability of the federal government versus other entities. And I think people don't really fully appreciate how large a sum of money $11 trillion is. So let me provide you with a couple of indicators that are suggestive of the issues that might be associated with drawing upon other groups to fund reparations, whether they're corporates or corporate groups or individuals. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that if you were to take the combined budgets of all state and local governments in the United States, and this would of course include Evanston, Illinois, or the state of California, if you were to take all of their budgets and add them up, it comes to $3.1 trillion. If you're accepting our premise that the required expenditure for reparations plan must be $11 trillion at least, then it would take 4 years for all of the state and federal governments in the United States to use all of their resources for a reparations fund to meet the bill. And of course, this is beyond realism. The second statistic or number that I'd like to give is the fact that individual donations or donations from corporations would have to be staggeringly high to get to the $11 trillion figure. So suppose generous donors were contributing $1 billion on a monthly basis to a reparations fund. So it would be $12 billion per annum. It would still take us 9 centuries to get to $11 trillion. And so I think if we're being realistic, it really is the federal government that has to do this. But the federal government is also the culpable party because, as Dr. Neiman pointed out, the institutions that committed to providing funds, the corporate institutions that committed to providing funds in the German case, said that what we did was legal, it was immoral. Okay, and so in the U.S. context, the same condition holds, that all of these organizations that participated in the benefits of the exploitation of slavery were doing something that was fully legal. And so the culpable party in an ultimate or final sense must be the entity that made those activities legal, and that's the federal government.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I agree with you that getting away from talk of individual guilt is the way to go, particularly since most white people didn't even come to this country until after the Civil War was over. So you get then the assertion, well, my people didn't own any slaves, they were somewhere in Poland, or
but those people probably did get Homestead Act grants or benefited from the practices of the Federal Housing Administration. Or benefited, yeah. So I
agree with you entirely. And as I, tell people when I'm giving talks, if your grandparents got Social Security or, a GI loan,
yes.
That was the beginning of a small house or a small care that allowed you to inherit a tiny down payment on, your own home that you would not have otherwise gotten.
Been able to get, yeah.
Totally agreed on that. And interestingly enough, there's a discussion now in Germany about what the relationship of people who immigrated to Germany starting in the 60s. We now have 1 in 4 of every German citizen has at least one non-German parent. So, you might say, what does a Turk or a Syrian have to do with the Nazi period? And it's a big, interesting subject of discussion and concern in education. But I agree with Professor Darity that, if you move to the country, even if you move under desperate conditions and you're not thinking a whole lot about the structure of the country and its history, you do inherit its history. So I think that's right. You're the economist, and so I have to trust you on the numbers. And I'm always
Never trust an economist.
don't tell me that, because who should I trust? I'm always happy when Paul Krugman writes, we shouldn't worry about inflation, and these programs are, we're fine, we're okay. But I do think that in the US, we don't often enough call industry into account. And I want to, I have to trust you on the numbers that the federal government is the only institution that could do all the work. But I want to leave you with one of my favorite facts, just because I like to spread it around. Malala, a few years ago, gave a speech to the UN in which she said you could educate every child on earth for 12 years on the profits made by the arms industry in, get this, 8 days a year. Okay. And I checked this actually with a Nobel laureate economist. You say, no, trust economists. I checked the figures with Amartya Sen. And he said, he took out a pencil and he said, yeah,
that's right.
That's about right. That makes sense. So, it seems to me that broadcasting information like that is, we don't know how to act on it. But it's an instance of the ways in which we don't call corporations to account. And I just think they ought to be involved.
I agree completely, if I can interject. And it's not, again, just for slavery. When there were lawsuits in the early part of the century, some of them were against companies like Aetna, insurance, who could trace their roots back to companies that insured slave ships and slave owners. And then there's companies like U.S. Steel, who is mentioned in the Douglas Blackman book, book that you had mentioned, Slavery by Another Name, who use these workers who own the coal mines that were using these people who were essentially kidnapped and imprisoned and had to work off the cost of their imprisonment. That was the excuse. And so U.S. Steel made money from exploiting African Americans. There's so many companies that can trace their roots back to this exploitation, and I think really should be called to disgorge some of those wrongfully obtained profits.
Well, this is not a hill that I want to die on. Insofar as the objective is to get the black-white wealth gap to be closed. So if we vary who the contributors are, that's okay. But I will say this once again, that all of these activities that were conducted by corporations and by individuals that we have to deem as atrocities took place under a legal and authority apparatus that was sanctioned by the federal government. So at best, these institutions or organizations would have to do this on a voluntary basis, just as they have in Germany. And, I don't know how many of them will voluntarily do it, but
there was some arm twisting in Germany. I mean, it's not that they all suddenly stood up and said, hey, we feel bad that we used slave labor. The government twisted some arms, but they came forward.
And companies knew that they were violating the law, but you can't get them because of the statute of limitations. I mean, let's not pretend that they were innocently receiving this labor. And so there's really kind of legal technicalities that might prevent them from having to suffer the consequences of their violating the law. But there was a 13th Amendment when a lot of this was happening in the 20th century.
And the 13th Amendment allows involuntary servitude and slavery under conditions of conviction of a crime. Yeah.
So they just invented a lot of crimes, which is what the Black Codes did.
Exactly.
I want to make sure that we could just sit and listen to this is an amazing conversation. I want to make sure that we do get to a few questions from the audience. They're really wonderful questions here. So let me start with, I think, a really straightforward one that many people kind of go to right away in asking this question about reparations. And the person wrote, how would one determine who receives reparation and how much they would receive? I believe that in the case of Holocaust reparations, not everyone received the same amount. So Professor Darity, you already laid out that you think the category of eligibility is direct descendants of slaves. So either with that definition, either with that parameter or with other parameters from our other two panelists, there is this question of who suffered how much and how much should different people get. How do we approach that issue? Any of you want to respond to that?
Well, I think that one way to address a lot of the depredations of the 21st century is to look at the housing issue and look at people who have been unable to acquire home ownership and try to facilitate that. I think one idea that Rothstein presented was in places like Levittown was it New York or Pennsylvania? Anyway, Levittown was this development that allowed a lot of people to acquire home ownership. And so as homes open up in that area, there could be preferential subsidies for African Americans who aren't homeowners to be able to acquire those homes. And I think that that's an excellent way to approach it in terms of we never had the 40 acres and a mule. Well, let's give people homesteads now in this way and support them in maintaining the homes. Because I think one of the things that often happens with African American homeownership is that it gets undermined by not having enough resources or not even having the legal knowledge to be able to keep those homes. You know, for example, a number of Black homeowners lost property through inheritance and the fact that the property was split between a number of different heirs. And these heirs were targeted, a couple of the heirs were targeted and paid off some amount. And so the people who targeted them became co-owners as well, and were able to go to court and force a sale and acquire that property for less than market value. And so people should be helped with respect to creating trust for ownership so that their properties doesn't have to go through probate. And I think that's something we could do right now for people, particularly with respect to what's happened in the pandemic and the possibilities that people might lose their homes through the probate process because they don't have sufficient legal structures or know those structures to be able to hold on to the property.
Thank you. I'm sure you everyone has a response, but let me bring another question in. Okay, so one person asked, points out that the timeline for the German case was so much shorter historically than the time that's transpired in America, and we've talked about the dangers of speaking in terms of reparations for slavery, but there's all the time passed since slavery and all of the time passed, just such a long period over which all of these injustices have been committed. So the person is asking, do any of the speakers have an opinion on whether the white supremacy embedded in the white American psyche might be more of a barrier and hindrance to reparations than in Germany?
Well, as I said, there were more West Germans, at least, opposed to reparations in the 50s, then the last time I checked, the polls, Americans were opposed to reparations. And again, I think we're all in agreement that it's a grave mistake to talk about reparations for slavery, because it's repeating an ignorance. I mean, it's not only wrong in terms of dealing with the wealth gap and the gap in home ownership and everything that goes along with that, but it's also repeating an ignorant view of our history, which is that the real problem stopped in 1865. And yeah, there was some prejudice, and that's too bad, but then Rosa Parks came along and everything was okay. I think many of us have, in the last 5 years, have produced a sea change, at least in white people's understanding of, those 100 years between the end of the Civil War and the passing of the Civil Rights Act. But I have to say, to my own shame, until I started researching this subject, I didn't know much more than that myself. And I grew up in the segregated South, and my mother was engaged in the civil rights movement. And so that was kind of the framework of my life. And I've been asking myself in the past few years, how come people did not talk about that 100-year historical gap? And the best answer I've been able to come up with is, people were still getting murdered for trying to register to vote or trying to help people register to vote. And, I couldn't swim in the same lake as a Black child. And there was so much to deal with in the present that no one was ready to, no one had any more space to think about the past or to look more carefully at less grotesque violations of human rights, like housing segregation and all of that. But, again, the idea that the Germans did things quickly is, first of all, based on the fact that we don't actually remember as white Americans how long and how continuous, oppression of Black people is in America. And secondly, we assume that the Germans somehow willingly woke up and said, gosh, we're sorry, let's do something to fix things. And they really, really didn't. It was work. And I have the feeling that Americans are in the process of doing that work right now.
I think some Americans are, but I think the question's a really good question, because white supremacy is still choking democracy. I mean, we saw it on January 6th. And we see white supremacy as being something, or we should see white supremacy as being something that is actually very self-defeating. And if you look at the book that Heather McGee just wrote about how we can't have nice things because of white supremacy, because there are white people who are so afraid that being democratic and allowing Black people to share in the prosperity will undermine their superiority as white people. So I think we really have to take that question very seriously. What can we do to kind of change the hearts or minds of people who are so attached to whiteness as being their status that gives them the identity of being an American?
Thank you.
I agree with you. I don't want to.
I want to ambitiously try to squeeze in 2 more questions in our remaining 6 minutes. A question that's because they're coming from multiple questioners. One is, notwithstanding broader support in the public, there obviously are serious hurdles in Congress to getting a program like this passed, and people are asking, would we not be better off looking at other kinds of large social programs, social initiatives around education, or something other than than reparations.
So people always want to duck the construction of a program that is specific to Black Americans, that involves a transfer of resources that would eliminate the racial wealth gap. They look for universal programs, they look for indirect programs, but these will not succeed in eliminating the racial wealth gap. So let me give just one example in terms of something that people frequently talk about, which is scholarships. The fact that folks need to take into account is that Black Americans who are heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who never finished high school. And this is largely attributable to the consequences of the intergenerational transmission of resources. If you come from families where your parents and grandparents had very little wealth that they had accumulated for all the reasons that we have described, then you're not going to have much wealth yourself, regardless of how well educated you are. And so that's not going to turn the trick. Home ownership in and of itself is not going to turn the trick. If we move to a position where Black Americans had the same rate of home ownership as white Americans, that would be approximately 75%. It would be moving Black Americans from 47% to 75%. It still wouldn't address the equity value differences in homes that are associated with whether or not you are a Black or a white homeowner. And it would not address the other components of wealth that are significant differences in asset holdings, whether it's business ownership, whether it's retirement accounts, whether it's stocks and bonds. I think that we have a tendency to focus exclusively on home ownership. But if we go back to the late 19th century, the type of asset that was being provided by the federal government was land. And non-residential real estate is a very significant portion of people's asset position in the present moment. So that's why I think we should make direct payments to eligible recipients and let them decide how they want to allocate those funds across a portfolio. There's no reason we should pinion people into being homeowners. There's no reason why we should pinion them into getting additional college education if our objective is to close the racial wealth gap. And the final point I'd like to make is that my premise, and the premise that Kirsten Mullen and I advance in our book, is that once you establish the overall sum, you make uniform payments to all eligible recipients. And so we bypass this question of whether or not person A has been harmed more than person B. We argue that there's been a collective harm, and it needs to be treated in such a way that each eligible recipient receives the same amount of compensation.
Thank you for that very helpful answer to that challenge. So I'll share with you one more question that several people have asked, and you can each, I guess, take about 1 minute to either respond to it or any other closing words you want to say. A lot of people have asked, were we to have a program like this, how does it impact the larger issue of racism in America? Does it make it worse? It doesn't seem like it would make it go away, right? It's a solution to a specific, a subset of a much bigger problem. And how do you see that? So again, to respond to that or any other closing words any of you wants to say.
In some countries, they say money whitens. Brazil particularly. And I think that Professor Nyman mentioned the kind of benefits of living in an integrated society. One is having neighbors. And so there are some people whose heart will never change, but that's not what really racism is. Racism is really these structural impediments to really realizing your potential. And so you'll never change everyone's minds, But if you give people a chance to really be what they can be without reference to, or without barriers that are based on their race, I think there'd be a lot of change.
Yeah, I think that reparations would provide Black Americans with the material conditions for full citizenship. There's a distinction that has to be made between stopping a harm and compensating people for the effects of the harm. Reparations is the latter. We also have to stop the harm. I guess as Malcolm X would put it, you have to pull the knife out as well as heal the wound. And reparations is healing the wound, but the knife needs to be pulled out also. And I think that if Black Americans had the additional resources that are associated with the reparations project, then they would also have more political resources that would facilitate their capacity to find more ways to keep pulling the knife out, as well as experiencing having the wound be healed.
So I'll agree with both the other panelists and just add, all of this, first of all, is a reason not to do what the West German government did in 1953, which was to say, we'll pay and then it's over, because of course it's not over. And the kind of historical reckoning that I think America, or part of America, is beginning to do is something that's going to be a work of generations, okay? And that's something that needs to accompany reparations, which are, compensation for deep historical injustice. But I'd also like to add, without, again, wanting to idealize the German case too much, but I have mostly lived in Berlin since 1982, and I have seen the transformation of this country very up close and personal. And, it's not perfect. There's stuff they do wrong. There's backlash. There will always be a backlash. There will always be racist and xenophobic people who prefer to blame their troubles on somebody who looks different. But by and large, this country is a much stronger, healthier place than it was by miles when I got here in 1982, expecting to stay a year, by the way. But there is something liberating, there's something purifying, there's something relieving, for the part of the population whose ancestors committed the injustice, that you can stand up and say, look, we did something to compensate. It's as if you compare walking down the streets of Berlin today with what it was like, nearly 40 years ago, you have a feeling that as if the weight has fallen from people's shoulders. That is, it's not just compensation to the victims, there's a sense of relief in the people who did something to reckon with this horrible past. And that's, the Heather McGhee book, which Professor Armstrong referenced, also argues, guys, this is not just doing something for people who were historically oppressed. We would, all of us, be better off.
I hate that we're out of time. I knew that this was going to be an amazing conversation, and it exceeded all expectations. I'm so grateful to the three of you on behalf of JTS for bringing your tremendous expertise, and the interchange between you was just enlightening. So thank you so much. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, "Not all are guilty, but all are responsible." And you have so eloquently reminded all of us of our responsibility. And I thank everyone for coming, and adjure all of us to keep standing up and doing what we need to do to fulfill that responsibility. Thank you so much again to all of our panelists for this wonderful program, and to the supporters of the Siegel Lecture for making this possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.